Confrontation with Saul, a turning point in Israel's history. Samuel's relationship with Saul, the first king of Israel, began on a hopeful note, but eventually deteriorated due to Saul's repeated disobedience to God's commands. This disobedience culminated in a significant confrontation between the prophet Samuel and King Saul, marking a crucial turning point in Israel's history and Saul's kingship. Background in Saul's disobedience. Saul's reign began with promise after he was chosen by God and anointed by Samuel to lead the Israelites. However, Saul's insecurity and impulsiveness soon led him astray. One of the most critical moments of disobedience occurred when God, through Samuel, commanded Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites, including their king, Agag, and all their livestock. This command was meant as divine judgment against the Amalekites for their opposition to Israel when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt. Saul, however, failed to fully execute God's command. Instead of destroying everything, he spared Agag and kept the best of the livestock, claiming he intended to sacrifice them to God. This act of selective obedience, driven by Saul's own reasoning and perhaps a desire to gain favor with the people, was a direct violation of God's instructions. The confrontation. When Samuel confronted Saul after the battle, Saul initially greeted Samuel with a claim that he had obeyed God's command. However, Samuel immediately questioned Saul about the sounds of sheep and cattle he could hear, exposing Saul's disobedience. Saul attempted to justify his actions by explaining that the spared livestock were intended for sacrifice, but Samuel rebuked him sharply. Samuel's words to Saul during this confrontation were both powerful and revealing of God's priorities. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. This declaration underscored the principle that God values obedience over ritualistic offerings, emphasizing that outward religious acts cannot compensate for the inner rebellion against his commands. The aftermath and execution of Agag. Samuel then informed Saul that because he had rejected the word of the Lord, God had rejected him as king. This pronouncement was devastating for Saul and marked the beginning of the end of his reign. The prophet's words were final and underscored the seriousness of Saul's failure to lead according to God's directives. To demonstrate the gravity of Saul's disobedience and to fulfill God's command, Samuel took it upon himself to execute Agag. This act was not only a fulfillment of divine justice, but also a symbolic gesture that reinforced the importance of complete obedience to God's commands. Samuel's action demonstrated that partial obedience is not sufficient in the eyes of God. Samuel's grief and God's regret. After this incident, Samuel and Saul parted ways, and they never saw each other again until the day of Saul's death. Samuel mourned deeply for Saul, grieving the downfall of a man who had once shown great potential as Israel's leader. His mourning reflected not only personal sorrow, but also concern for the future of Israel under a king who had fallen out of favor with God. The Bible records that God regretted making Saul king over Israel. This divine regret did not indicate a mistake on God's part, as God is omniscient and sovereign, but rather expressed God's sorrow over Saul's failure and the consequences of his disobedience. It highlighted the seriousness of Saul's rebellion and its impact on the nation of Israel. Conclusion. The confrontation between Samuel and Saul was a pivotal moment in the narrative of Israel's monarchy. It highlighted the importance of complete obedience to God and the dire consequences of disobedience. Saul's failure to follow God's command led to his rejection as king, demonstrating that God's leaders are expected to follow his will fully. Samuel's grief over Saul and God's regret at his kingship underscore the gravity of Saul's disobedience and the enduring truth that God values obedience above all other offerings.